Welcome back to another episode of 40 Facts About the 40K Universe. I am your host, Gershwan, and you were watching One Mind Syndicate. Today we continue talking about the Imperial Fists as we get into Lysander. If you're new to the channel, subscribe. We post Warhammer 40K lore videos every single day. If you have any suggestions, please comment down below. And don't forget to hit the little bell notification icon to stay updated, just in case we do create a video for you based on your suggestion. And thank our patrons on Patreon. It's because of them that we can do this. Link in the description if you guys want to support us. But with that said, let's get into 40 facts on Lysander. Darneth Lysander is the first captain of the Imperial Fist Chapter's first company, overseer of the armory, and watch commander of the Imperial Fist mobile monastery, Phalanx. Even for the Space Marines, Darneth Lysander has led a long and bloody career. Lysander is rare among Space Marines of this present era, for he was recruited on Tala itself. His 13-year pilgrimage toward becoming an Astartes began with his parents before his birth, following a difficult path towards a pilgrimage to Tala from their homeworld that was interrupted by betrayal, enslavement, and the murder of his family. Lysander was kept alive by the charity of the Imperial cult and his own wits, learning to fight at first for survival, and then to complete the pilgrimage his parents had begun. His road to Tala was fraught with peril, such as the devastation of Grozdak, and the horror of the Quesark heresy, and the subsequent imperial purging of Quesark. The determination of the pilgrim boy gradually became known in high places, and upon his arrival on Tala, he was greeted as a hero. At that time, Chaplain Shadris of the Imperial Fists was on Tala conducting chapter business and first heard the extraordinary young man's tale. He sought out the young pilgrim by the Pillar of Bone, a monument that was believed to have been erected on Tala to commemorate the Imperial Fist's courage in the unnamed campaign. But in reality, it was actually a sacred holy relic that was the last remnant of the once great Imperial Fist Fortress Monastery that had once existed on Tala in the days of the Great Crusade. Part of Chaplain Shadris' sacred mission as a chaplain was to bring fresh relics of the Imperial Fists to the Pillar, but he also came to mankind's homeworld to recruit pilgrims from across the Imperium, who were deemed worthy of becoming aspirants of the chapter. It seemed to Shadris that Lysander had the blessing of Rogel Dorne upon him. Lysander excelled on the harsh training fields of Juno and Ganymede, progressing through indoctrination and training with a speed seldom before witnessed. Under Shadris' tutelage, he learned that the Emperor was not a god, as the Imperial cult decreed, but a mighty warrior and visionary from whose mortal flesh the Space Marines had sprung. Lysander rejected this at first, for faith had been the only substance he had known for much of his younger life. However, he soon came to embrace this new truth, realizing that it made the Emperor no less a savior. Like all those who had come before him, Lysander pledged his life to upholding the Emperor's work, not as the helpless worshipper he had once been, but as a warrior honoring the deeds of an illustrious forefather. Years passed, and Lysander passed into Captain Jostin's second company, the Sword of Tara, where he quickly rose to the rank of sergeant. Here, to the outrage of his peers, he casted out the official bolter drill honed over many thousands of years. Instead, Lysander trained his battle brothers in the more unorthodox techniques he had learned from Jonas Macan, the sober scout sergeant who had inducted him into the art of war. When Jostin challenged Lysander about his breach of tradition, he refused to back down, arguing that effectiveness counted for more than blind adherence. However, in the end, it was only Chandrin's intervention that prevented Lysander's demotion. The name Lysander first appeared on the Libre Honoris of the Imperial Fist chapter in the 567th year of the 40th millennium, when as a sergeant of the Second Company, he was first recognized for his leadership and valor during the actions on the planet of Induno during the Battle of the Colonial Bridge. There, 3 tactical squads from the Second Company held the bridge leading to the governor's palace, against a cultist horde of some 3,000 lost souls. Captain Jostin perished in the initial moments of the attack, A lucky autogon shell smashed through his helm's left eyepiece to bury itself deep in his brain. With Jostin's death, Lysander took command, directing the survivors in a clockwork volley first impressed upon him by the Sergeant McCann. Unable to make headway through the storm of roaring shells, the cultists fell back in disarray, leaving a bloody rampart of their own dead behind. The Battle of Colonial Bridge was the first time that Lysander's name was recorded in the chapter's Libra Honoris. The same technique that had once threatened to bring him to ruin now earned him great honor. The battle also granted Lysander a first glimpse of one of the traitorous Iron Warriors. It had been their heresies that had brought insurrection on Indino, and one of their augmented warriors was later discovered amongst the dead. The renegade's presence was enough to bring the full might of the Imperial Fist down on Indino, but no further traces of Perturabo's treacherous sons were found. In the wake of Indino, Lysander earned many more Imperial laurels. He became known as a warrior who could hold any position, no matter how indefensible it might appear to others. Yet he was no stranger to daring assaults either. Instead, it was following the capture of the Eldar cruiser Blood of Cain that he rose to command of the Second Company. When the Imperial Fists deployed to break the 3-year siege of Heydrich Tor, a planet in merciless grasp of the Iron Warrior's warsmith, Shantu, it was Lysander who commanded the drop-pod assault onto the heights. Having secured the high ground, Lysander's strike force set up teleporter homers to summon the Terminators of the First Company into the thick of the fighting. Alas, the defenders had set a tremor in the warp, and many of the Terminators materialized over deep chasms, or else in solid rock. Cletus, captain of the First Company, was one of these, his body reforming around solid stone. Before he died, he thrusted his thunderhammer, the Fist of Dorne, into Lysander's hand, and bade him seek vengeance through victory. This Lysander did, leading the survivors of the First Company alongside his own to shatter the Iron Warrior's stronghold. Shantu fled from the planet in defeat, but he had left a mystery in his wake. Survivors spoke of how the warsmith had concerned himself little with the desolation of their world, and had instead buried himself in a search through its millennia-old archives. Unfortunately, there was no way to know what Shantu had been searching for, as he had destroyed the archives before making his escape. In the reorganization that followed Heydrich Tor, Lysander was elevated to the rank of First Captain, Master of the First Company, Overseer of the Armory, and Watch Commander of Phalanx. Chaplain Chandris, now many centuries old, looked upon the path his recruit had walked, and saw his faith had been rewarded. Lysander's next noteworthy victory came against the Chaos Space Marines of the Alpha Legion in the Jorgut cluster while putting down an insurrection on the world of Kelbanor III. The Imperial Fist forces, under the First Captain's command, captured the traitor Marines' Chaos Champion, Yalo Vex, and his inner circle while they were desecrating the Cathedral of St. Aspera. After receiving guidance from the Inquisition, Lysander pursued the enemy back to their lair in the form of a remote space station constructed in the heart of an asteroid. Lysander immediately launched a surprise attack on the enemy cruiser while its power was offline and the ship was docked. The courageous captain personally led the boarding party of Terminators that had teleported aboard the Alpha Legion's vessel. They held off Alpha Legion reprisal for several hours while the Third Company landed in Thunderhawk gunships and fought their way through the space station's dock complex to reinforce the Imperial Fist veterans already aboard the cruiser. Lysander defeated no less than 7 foul champions of the Dark Gods. At the height of the battle, the Chaos Space Marines made a desperate last assault on the First Company's encircled warriors. This appeared successful before Lysander countered with their attack, ambushing them in mid-assault by cutting through the cruiser's interposing bulkhead with his Terminator's Chain Fist and Thunderhammers. Under attack from multiple directions, the enemy's plight was only reinforced by the Third Company's arrival. The traitors fled into the tunnels of their asteroid base, earning only a brief respite before Lysander's Terminator Squad purged the last of the heretics. Another 2 Terran centuries of honored service as the master of the First Company awaited him before events conspired to bring about a tragedy. Toward the end of the 40th millennium, Lysander was traveling aboard the Imperial Fist strike cruiser Shield of Valor when it was lost in the warp. With him was a lost sizable portion of the First Company. The Imperial Fists awaited, hoping for the eventual return, but it was all to no avail. For decades and then centuries passed with no signs of the starship's return to real space. All hope was given up, and Lysander's name was entered on the roster of the chapter's fallen, and his statue placed in the Hall of Heroes in the Phalanx. Yet Lysander and his crew were not so dead as any opposed. Due to the fickle tides of the warp, the Shield of Valor returned to normal space nearly 1,000 Terran years later, in the 964 year of the 41st millennium. However, the location that the Imperial Fists found themselves in was hardly any better. They were located in the outer orbit of the Iron Warriors Traitor Legion's stronghold. It was a world called Malodrax, on the western fringe of the Eye of Terror. The Iron Warriors were quick in their reaction, and the firepower of 3 orbital fortresses disabled the strike cruiser. Lysander and a handful of Imperial Fist survivors were easily captured by the Iron Warriors. Lysander's captor, the warsmith Sean II, believed himself a reincarnation of the legendary Dark Age warlord who had bore the same name. He had christened Malodrax after his predecessor's mythical fortress, and he went about his bloody tortures. Sean II recounted his glorious past deeds, ever boasting of the horrific legend he would forge. He spoke endlessly of the Spear Hydros, bringer of the swarm, and his search to reclaim the Leviathan war barrack Tamunash, whose weapon had laid waste to 1,000 worlds, and Sean II boasted would do so again. In the hands of their most hated foe, the Imperial Fists were shown no mercy or pity. The Iron Warriors tortured them for weeks, and only the astonishing tenacity of the Sons of Dorne allowed them to survive a full month of incarceration and the tender mercies of the Iron Warriors. Although Lysander's body was bloody and broken, his will remained intact. Throwing off his shackles, he and a handful of Imperial Fist survivors fought their way unarmored and initially with no weapons except for their fury and their fists through the planetary capital, managing to reach a shuttle and escape into the void. Lysander returned to the chapter and was received with great acclaim by his battle brothers and the chapter council, although none of them had even been born when the Shield of Valor had been lost to the warp. His legend remained strong among the Astartes of the chapter, and his actions still provided inspiration to new battle brothers. For all the joy at his miraculous return, a deep vein of fear was rooted in the minds of the Imperial Fists, that their hero had been corrupted in some way during his time spent in the warp and the dungeons of the Iron Warriors. Lysander underwent 6 months of meticulous examination by the Imperial Fist librarians and apothecaries, in which his body and psyche were tested against the chapter's records. Every corner of his soul and every cell in his body was examined thoroughly, leaving no doubt in the minds of their brothers that Lysander was free of any spiritual or physical taint. With thunderous approval, Lysander was ultimately restored to his post as the captain of the First Company. Within 6 months of his reappointment, Lysander returned to Malodrax to avenge those lost, and his own suffering at the hands of the Iron Warriors. None could stand before the righteous fury of the Imperial Fists as Lysander claimed his revenge. Once Malodrax had been cleansed, Lysander vowed to scour the foul stain of the Iron Warriors from the galaxy once and for all. Gathering warriors from across the vast holdings of the Imperium, he initiated a crusade against the Imperial Fists' most hated foe that continued to this day. Though Shun-Tu escaped that maelstrom of blood and fire, he did so weakened and beaten. Yet Mallodrax was but the start. Lysander's vengeance had only just begun. Following the scouring of Maldrax, Lysander threw himself into the extermination of the Iron Warriors. Within 3 years, the captain had masterminded and led the destruction of 3 other fortress worlds bordering the Eye of Terror, one of which, the Black Star Redoubt, had ground 3 separate Cadian assaults into bloody paste across the previous decade. In his work, Lysander had the approval of his chapter master Vladimir Pugh, and the tactic devotion from the rest of his battle brothers, which bordered upon worship. Pugh was, if anything, slightly wary of Lysander, for he feared that the others might attempt to leverage his reputation in an effort to become the next chapter master. In another man, Pugh's concerns might have been result of ego or pettiness, but such things were entirely alien to his nature. An honest and honorable warrior, even by the exacting standards of the Imperial Fists, Pugh would have readily stood aside for a worthy candidate. The chapter master could not quite ally his concerns with Lysander, with whom he had clashed on several occasions since his return. Pugh found his first captain a little too stubborn, a little too swift, to recount the ways in which his experience exceeded that of his chapter master. Even discounting Lysander's lost millennium in the warp, he had nearly a century of experience over any living Imperial Fist. Pugh did not wish to fight Lysander's ascension, which he saw as inevitable. He merely wished to delay that day until Lysander was truly ready for the chapter's glided throne. Pugh had always felt that his own ascension had come too early, that the deaths of 170 Imperial Fists in the Boreal planet strike could have been avoided, but for his own stubborn refusal to fall back. Pugh had learned from this disaster, but considered the price of that wisdom too steep. For his part, Lysander was still coming to terms with life in a new millennium. Much was the same, for bureaucratic tradition had made it so. But almost every warrior he had known from before was now dead. Most had perished on the Emperor's battlefield, bringing his vengeance to the enemies of mankind, and Chaplain Chandris had passed on during the siege of Moros, at last having found a foe canny enough to take his life. Joran McCann, Lysander's scout sergeant during his formative years, was now interned within a dreadnought's adamantium sarcophagus, but his mind was so scattered that he no longer recognized his old student. Such was Lysander's unrelenting ferociousness in his pursuit of the Iron Warriors that the Imperial Fists often entered battle lacking of their full first company, which was all too often hammering yet another renegade fortress to dust by many light-year distance. Other chapter masters might have sought to quell so personal a crusade before it overtakes a Space Marine's broader and selfless duty. However, the 10,000-year hatred between the Iron Warriors and the Imperial Fists was a powerful force, and Pugh found it difficult that a part of the chapter's strength was ever dedicated to repaying the slights of the Iron Cage and 10,000 other battles. The First Company did not always fight alone, as Lysander's plan grew even more ambitious. Pugh assigned additional forces to his temporary command. At the Revellon Maze, Lysander's strike force consisted not only of the First Company, but also demi-companies from the 2nd and 5th. At the Black Star Redoubt, Pugh himself accompanied the 3rd and 9th Company, content to serve as Lysander's strategic observer, the better to take full measure of his first captain's ability. Nevertheless, and despite his intended detachment, Pugh found himself fighting at Lysander's side in the final assault on the weapon forge. He saw the fists of Dorne shatter the vast black gates, and cheered as loud as any of his battle brothers as Lysander smote the towering demon prince who served as master of the forge. A day later, when Pugh watched from orbit as a barrage bomb collapsed the Black Star Redoubt's iron spire, he knew that the time had come. Upon the return to Phalanx, Pugh would step down. The future of the Imperial Fists would lie in Lysander's hand. Then came the attack on Tala Dorne. The Iron Warriors had not sat idly by, while Lysander had leveled their holdings. An influential new warlord had risen to power amongst Perturabo's sons. With promise of revenge and dark glory, he raised a new army, the Sons of the Forge, from the remnants of the warbands crushed by Lysander's hammer blows. No one but his warlord knew why the manufactorum world of Dorne was chosen, except perhaps as an object lesson in needless malice. There was certainly no military goal beyond the stark application of terror, a reassertion of the Iron Warriors' might following a string of defeats. The fleet of gunmetal battleships struck Dorne without warning, pounding the world's defenses into rubble before unleashing wave after wave of dreadclaws upon the planet's surface. Dropships in the shape of tentacled dragons followed, their coiled feelers flailing as they sought purchase amongst the manufactorum's upper towers. As the vessels settled into position, warsmiths struck runes of containment from the passenger bays, and snarling demon engines spilled into the city streets. Defense commanders mustered what force they could, but troop recruitment to confront the violence of gangs, smugglers, and pirates were too little use against the monstrosities that now tore their regiments to red ruin. Valkyries, operating from a hidden airbase on the polar continent, screamed south to engage a second wave of renegade dropships, but were swatted from the sky by the Helldrakes that swooped and dove upon Dorne's volcanic thermals. Dorne Primus, seat of the planetary governor, surrendered after less than a day's fighting. Before the week was out, almost all the other cities had petitioned for mercy. Only Dorne Decimus, located in the extreme south, still stood unconquered. Built as it was into the side of an obsidian mountain, its defenses had ridden out the bombardment better than those of its fellows. Any dreadclaw that landed within range of Decimus's guns was blown apart by shellfire, and any dropship or Helldrake that entered its skies risked obliteration by its impressive array of defense lasers. Yet stalwart as it was, Decimus could not offer assistance to its fellows. Thus did its inhabitants watch helplessly as the Iron Warriors set about enslaving the population, praying all the while that the storm of iron would leave them untouched. In the following weeks, the Iron Warriors brought great change upon the planet. Dorne Primus was overrun by coiled mecha roots, woven together to form a vast dome structure over the ruins. This had become the Forge Heart, an imposing citadel beneath which the Iron Warriors grafted bonded slaves, men and women who had embraced domination for promise of mechanical apotheoses, fed the bellowing demon forge night and day. The previous inhabitants, those who still lived, now toiled beneath Dorne's Sextus. This blasted ruin was now little more than a forced labor mining complex, squatting amongst the rubble and supplying precious ore to the warp foundries beneath the Forge Heart. By the time the Imperium responded, millions had perished in the mines, and the mecha roots had spread to cover almost the entire southern continent. Dorne was well on its way to becoming a new fortress world. Dorne had been under occupation for a little over 2 months when the Space Marines at last arrived. This was not a coordinated counter-strike, but a piecemeal response to Dorne's garbled distress call. Thus, when the Imperial fists arrived, they found the world's orbit lit with lance flares and torpedo trails, and an impressive fleet of Crimson Ascalon-class frigates engaging the Iron Warrior fleet. The Blood Angels' vessels attacked with their customary bravado, ignoring the disparity in size and numbers. Already one of the Chaos battle fleets was afire along its length, buffs of atmosphere venting as escape pods hurled out into the void. As Lysander watched from the bridge of the battle barge Storm of Wrath, a cluster of boarding torpedoes struck home against the tail section of a second Iron Warrior ship. The first captain knew them to contain Blood Angel boarding parties, a brave but reckless strategy. Deeming that the moment of the Blood Angels' assault would soon dwindle, Lysander ordered the Storm of Wrath and its support fleet to join the battle. The Iron Warrior's admiral was quick to respond. Like Lysander, he knew that the Storm of Wrath was the single mightiest vessel so far engaged. Its survival or destruction would determine where victory lay. At an unseen command, 3 Chaos-heavy cruisers came about on an interception heading, swarms of Helldrakes boiling out of their fighter bays, ignoring the Blood Angel frigates. They bore down on the Storm of Wrath with violent determination. As the Storm of Wrath's guns fired their first salvo, another force entered the growing battle, as the Ultramarine strike cruiser Valin's Revenge bursted into real space off the battle barge's port flank. The newcomer fired its prow guns in brief salute, then drove in hard beneath the Storm of Wrath, its dorsal weapon battery roaring as it obliterated a vanguard wave of Helldrakes. The prudent actions of Lysander to have taken at that point would have been to obliterate or repel the Chaos fleet before initiating Planet Strike. However, he quickly decided otherwise. When later recounting the battle to the chapter council, Lysander would cite his concern that every moment of delay was another moment in which the Forge Heart defense system could have been brought online. But the truth of the matter was that he had little patience for dueling amongst the stars, while the Iron Warrior's grip lay tight about the Imperial world. Ordering the Storm of Wrath into a slow belly roll to bring its deployment chutes into alignment, Lysander left command of the battle barge with his commodore and ordered his assault force to their drop pods. As the heavy cruiser reached weapon range and the battle barge's hull began to shudder under shell impact, the Imperial Fist launched their assault on Talador. The first wave of Imperial Fist Planet Strike came as a storm of barrage bombs and land strikes. They slammed into the Forge Heart like bolts of divine fury, collapsing sections of the dome to crush the smokestacks and demon forges below. Mecha roots flailed like wounded animals, the ends thrashing madly through the bombardment dust clouds. A few defense batteries returned sporadic fire, but a second bombardment followed hard on the heels of the first, silencing those emplacements. Scores of Iron Warriors and many hundreds of their bond slaves perished in those opening salvos, blown apart by shockwaves or crushed flat by falling rubble. The planetary assault began in earnest, even as the aftershock ceased. Lysander had given the honor of vanguard to Vorn Hagen's 5th Company, and they struck with precision worthy of Dorne. Drop pods screamed downward, their retro thrusters pinpricks of brilliant white against an angry red sky. They tore through the weakened section in the Forge Heart's dome, slamming into the rubble below. Drop pod hatches slammed down as one, and the battle brothers of the 5th Company strode out into a debris-choked air, bolters blazing as they came. An instant later, the air flickered as Captain Lysander and 3 squads of the 1st Company's Terminators teleported into position. Lysander had ordered the rest of the 1st Company, under the command of honored Sergeant Julin, to capture the slave pens beneath Taladorn's Sextus. Lysander was aware that splitting his already outnumbered force was something of a risk, but had few doubts about Julin's ability, and none at all about his own. The counterattack began almost immediately. Bolter and autoshells screamed from amongst the rubble, every weapon aimed by a hated Iron Warrior or a zealous bond slave hoping to earn his master's favor. Still, the Imperial Fists came on. Under Lysander's command, they advanced across the shattered tangles of adamantium, ignoring all thought of cover. Heavier weapon fire split the air. Las cannon crewed from the balconies of smoked blackened spires, spitting bright death. Devastators returned fire, missiles and heavy bolter shells hammering at the defenders' positions. A vast stone balcony, all but disintegrated under the impact of 2 crack missiles, and screaming cultists plunged to their death amidst the rubble below, their bodies trapped beneath the advancing Imperial Fists. All at once the defenders' fire slacked as the bond slaves retreated into the tangles of corridors, leaving their masters to fend for themselves. Not so much as a single Iron Warrior took a step backwards, planting their feet firmly amongst the wreckage. The traitors taunted their ancient enemies, daring them to come forward and die. The Imperial Fist response came as another volley of bolter fire, the roar of the guns drowning out the foe's taunts. Captain Vogan's 3rd Company did not deploy for another quarter of an hour, their launch delayed by a concentrated bombing run on the Storm of Wrath, By the time their drop pod smashed home amongst the dead and dying, the battle had moved on. Comm traffic told Vogan that Lysander had moved on into the fortress command spire, and half of his 5th company had gone with him. The rest, under Hagen's command, had spread out to secure the fortress depths. Bolter fire still ranging in the middle distance, the battle was far from over. The further into the Forge Heart the 3rd Company drove, the more twisted it became. Gone were the stark lines of the Imperial Manufactorum. Instead, mecha roots pulsed and withered around pillars fused from metal and flesh. Not all of Taladorn's inhabitants had survived to reach the mines. Many, infected by some machine contagion, had become the materials from which the Forge Heart had been fashioned. Their contoured faces stared out from the walls, mouth open in silent screams at their horrific fate. Veteran Sergeant Garadon, Vogan's second-in-command and the company's most decorated warrior, broke his customary silence as he looked upon these tortured dead and swore to avenge them. Under Vogan's command, the newcomers pushed on into the hellish maze of smelting pits and blazing forges. Lysander's trail of destruction was easily found, but following it was another matter. More Iron Warriors were converging onto the battle, drawn to Lysander's presence as moths to a vengeful flame. They found the 3rd Company instead, and a vicious running battle broke out amongst the smelting pits. Some of the gantry lines and scaffolds were unstable, and many combatants' battles ended not in glorious volleys of bolter fire, but in seething pits of molten metal. As the battle raged on, a quadrupedal demon engine charged out of the darkness. It leapt high onto a wall, then pounced down into a tactical squad run-on. 5 battle brothers went down as the Mauler Fiend struck, the survivors hurled away by the beast's flailing tentacles. The demon engine was in motion again, even before its victims had hit the ground, pistons driving it onward towards Vogan. The captain had but a moment before the creature was on him, and it was not enough. Even as Vogan's crackling power fist came around, the Mauler Fiend slammed into him. The beast's colossal mass bore the captain to the ground, and Vogan's gauntlet slammed into the side of its armored skull. The blow smashed one of the monster's glittering eyes, leaving a vivid scar of ruined metal in its place. The beast barely slowed. With a hiss of pistons, it punched a massive fist down onto the captain's breastplate, shattering his power armor and pulping the Space Marine's chest. Vogan died instantly. Tearing his attention from the traitorous Marines, Sergeant Garadon barked orders into his comlink. Las cannons blazed, boring deep into the beast's warped metal torso. The Mauler Fiend roared in pain and gathered itself for another pounce, but the las cannon flared for a second time, their devastating energy striking with precision and shearing off one of the demon engine's 4th legs. With a last terrible roar, the Mauler Fiend slumped to its side, oil blood spilled from its wounds. With the demon engine's defeat, the Iron Warrior's determination faded. In ones and twos, they broke off into the darkened corridors, detailing the remains of Squad Renan to carry Captain Vogan's remains back to the drop zone. Garadon assumed command and redoubled the company's pace. At last, after what seemed to be an age, the 3rd Company emerged onto the pinnacle of the command spire, or what was left of it. What had once been the planetary governor's palace was now overrun by the coiling corruption of the Iron Warriors. Scattered throughout, windows and gateways were vast, coil-encrusted hexagonal pods. At the apex of each, cables pulsed as they delivered vital fluids to whatever lay within. But it was the battle raging at the chamber's heart that drew Garadon's attention. There amongst the carbon-scored tangled of ruined machinery, some 30 warriors of the 5th Company fought alongside the bulkier Terminator-armored veterans of the 1st. The dead were piled deep around them, but there was golden armor amongst the gray. To Garadon's eyes, too many battle brothers had fallen, and more would perish before this battle was done. The Imperial fists were severely outnumbered, and their air was full of metallic roars of demon engines. In the center of the chamber, Lysander clashed with a heavier, bulkier figure clad in what had once been Terminator armor. Now both flesh and armor were merged, a horrific melding of man and machine. This was the warlord of the Sons of the Forge, come at last to face his domain's invaders. Garradon didn't hesitate. With a single barked word of command, he threw the third company into the fray. Lysander saw none of it, for he was lost to the battle with his hated foe. This was no mere warlord he faced, but Shantu, ruler of vile Maladrax. The fist of Dorne swung about, shattering Shantu's left shoulder guard, but still the warlord came on, a leer upon his face, and a demon sword grasped tight in his left hand. Knocking Lysander's second blow aside, Shantu slammed his unwounded shoulder into Lysander's chest. As the first captain staggered backwards, Shantu pressed the fingers of his free hand tight upon his left gauntlet. Responding to this silent signal, the pods lined about the wall cracked open with a flare of greenish gas, and the feeder cables tore free. Metallic roars echoed across the command spire, their timbre somewhere between rage and agony. The scores of glistening demon engines lurched forward into the battle. As Lysander threw himself at Shantu once again, his command link crackled into life. The blockage fleet had been driven off, the Ultramarines had made orbit, and Captain Sikaris was now offering reinforcement. Lysander was enraged. This was the Imperial Fist's battle. Honor decreed that they would claim victory from their adversaries, as they had many times before. Hagen's forces would soon return from the depths to join the battle, and Perturabo's cursed children would be annihilated. Catching the strike of Shantu's demon sword high upon his shield, the first captain angrily refused the Ultramarines' assistance and fought on. Elsewhere, the newly birthed demon engines had seemed disoriented at first, and this gave Sergeant Garradon some much-needed time to react. The third company were still somewhat distant from the linking up with the beleaguered battle brothers, so Garradon ordered the warriors to form a defensive ring in the heart of the nearest courtyard. From this living fortress, his devastators could track and destroy the onrushing demon engines. At least that was the plan. As his battle brothers took their positions, Garradon saw that these monstrosities were not quite the same as the creature that had slain Vogan. They were incomplete somehow, trailing metal tubings and vicious fluids. Some had stubby, half-formed weaponry. Others had warped and molted armor, the texture akin to molten wax. They were unfinished, Garradon realized. Shantu must have been desperate in need, but half-forged or not, the newly woken demon engines quickly proved themselves fearsome foes. A roar of engines from the skies above at last denoted the arrival of the flight of Imperial Fist storm ravens. The heavy rasping of their assault cannons a welcome sound amidst the carnage. The heavy shells tore into the Iron Warriors, driving them back from where the 5th Company, who had accompanied Lysander, stood. They made little impact on the demon engine's armor hides. With a screech, a Helldrake plunged from the bleak skies, its talons tearing down into one of the storm ravens. Crippled, the flyer plunged downward, its impact tearing a bloody furrow through the 3rd Company's position. As more Helldrakes arrived from the skies, the surviving storm ravens banked away to begin their own fight for survival. Between their intervention and the fortitude of the 1st Company's Terminators, the 5th would endure. The same could not be said for those who had fought to rescue them. Its formation scattered by the Storm Raven's impact, the 3rd Company was being mauled. Fire rained down from all sides, and 24 battle brothers had fallen already. The survivors fought on, teeth gritted against the pain of their wounds, but their foes were too many. A Forge Fiend's autocannon blazed, and 3 battle brothers of Squad Tyon were torn apart. Brother Conrath, the lone dreadnought assigned to the 3rd Company, turned his multi-melta on the monstrosity and reduced it to a steaming slag, but his armor soon buckled as other demon engines returned fire. Rolling gouts of warp energy tore through the 3rd Company's position, the blistering clouds melting armor and incinerating flesh. Sergeant Garradon, his right arm shattered by an autocannon shell, saw his brothers dying about him and roared defiance. Again, Lysander's command link crackled into life, an offer of assistance, but again he refused. Hagen, as yet unaware of the situation atop the spire, made no response, but Garradon looked around at the ruin of his battle brothers and came to the decision. Triggering his own comm, he made formal acceptance of Sikaris' offer. Lysander's bellow of rage flooded the channel and drowned out the Ultramarines' response. Garradon paid no heed and triggered his teleporter Homer. A moment later, there was a flicker of motion as some 30 Ultramarine Terminators materialized in the chamber. Storm bolters and auto-assault cannons already bellowing their anthem of war. This new arrival marked the last turning point in the Battle of Taladorn. Shantu had no surprises left, and following Garradon's request for assistance, the forces marshaled against the Warsmith rose steeply. Next to arrive were the Ultramarine 2nd Company, the Thunderhawks Gladius and Spatha, descending from the skies amidst a whining of turbo-laser fire. Hard on their heels, deploying from Storm-Raven gunships at breakneck speed, were the vanguard of Captain Tycho's Blood Angels. Where before the Space Marines had been outnumbered, now they had the upper hand. The Ultramarines advanced methodically through the rubble, their line of battle expanding and contracting to match the Iron Warriors' desperate counterattacks. One of Shantu's lieutenants, a giant of a man named Merex, took refuge in the remains of a divinitous shrine. The brute directed his fellows' fire with such ruthless efficiency that an Ultramarine who approached was all but torn apart. This ended when Tycho loosened his death company against the ruins. Seemingly impervious to pain, the black-armored warriors forged on through the storm of fire, hacking at the defenders with chainswords or tearing them apart with bare hands. Overwhelmed by their fury, Merex's makeshift bastion collapsed. The survivors left to the Ultramarines' guns. By the time Captain Hagen's demi-company had reached the command spire, the force upon which Lysander had pinned his hopes of victory, the Iron Warriors were in full retreat. Shantu, seeing his cause lost, fled with his followers and escaped into the tunnels below. It would take many more days to fully drive the Iron Warriors from Taladorn, and to scour their works from the planet's surface, but no effort was spared until the task was complete. Dozens of traitorous and many hundreds of bond slaves were hunted down and slain, but of Shantu no trace could be found. Lysander said little in that time and spoke not at all to Sikaris and Tycho, instead leaving Sergeant Julin to parley with what he still saw as an unwelcomed ally. Once Shantu had fled beyond his reach, Lysander had at last awoken from his vengeful fever and was forced to confront the cost of his obsession, and it was a high cost. Over 90 of his battle brothers had been slain, including Captain Vogan. Had Lysander awaited to make a coordinated assault with the Ultramarines, or Blood Angels, many of those deaths could have been avoided. Worse, had the Ultramarines not intervened, the tally of honored dead would have been much higher. As for Garradon, he and the 3rd Company played little part in the closing phases of Taladorn's campaign. The apothecaries deemed a dozen battle brothers of the Sentinels of Terra fit to fight, and the sergeant was not amongst them. As the 5th Company aided the Ultramarines and Blood Angels in scouring Taladorn, Garradon endured a frustrating period of convalescence. The inactivity gave him much time to think on the 3rd Company's fate, and by the time the Storm of Wrath was en route to Phalanx, Garradon was determined that Lysander's prideful folly would be brought to account. The return of Lysander's strike force to Phalanx should have been a time of sober celebration, but such was not to be. Shortly after the Storm of Wrath had taken formation with the rest of the Imperial Fist fleet, Sergeant Garradon had requested a private audience with Vladimir Pugh, and thereby laid bare the story of the 3rd Company's near demise. Such a meeting was not altogether unusual amongst the Imperial Fists, for the warriors of the chapter had ever held one another to the highest standards of discipline. Nevertheless, this was not a step that Garradon took lightly. For a sergeant to seek censure of a captain was unusual enough. To demand it of an honored hero like Lysander, there would be no good outcome from such a challenge. It said much of Garradon's unease at the situation that he had 3 times sought Lysander out during the homeward voyage. He had hoped to see some element of regret from the captain, some sign that the follies of Taladorn would not occur again. On each occasion, Garradon was angrily dismissed, with Lysander threatening to strip the sergeant off his rank if he persisted. Garradon was perceptive enough to recognize that he was not the true target of the captain's anger, but wise enough to realize that matters had progressed beyond his ability to rectify. Pugh was greatly displeased. His anger stemmed not from the sergeant's honesty. Indeed, he commended Garradon for speaking on the matter. Nor was the rendition of the Battle of Dorne entirely new to him. Lysander had already given his account of the engagement, a report that had been honest in every detail, from his bold planet strike through to his repeated refusal of assistance. What concerned Pugh was the fact that Lysander showed no sign of remorse at the outcome his decisions had led to. The first captain cared only that the Iron Warriors had been defeated and that the world returned to the Imperial fold. Pugh found this attitude dangerous. There had been triumph at Dorne, true enough, but bought with such needless sacrifice that another dozen such victories would see the glorious tradition of the Imperial Fist ended altogether. Too often had the blood of Dorne guided his children down such a path. The invaders, to name but one of the Imperial Fist's successors, ever risked annihilation because of their stubborn refusal to back away from the unwinnable. Pugh knew that many of the Imperial Fist captains looked to Lysander for example, rather to himself, which could become problematic if the first captain's deeds were unchallenged. After several days of silent meditation, and with heavy heart, Pugh convened the chapter council to judge Lysander's conduct. Thus did the other 8 surviving captains of the Imperial Fist convene in the shadow-shrouded cloister of remembrance to determine if pride rather than duty had come to rule Lysander's actions. This was an old tradition. The captains affirmed their obligation beneath the gaze of the honored dead. Golden statues, each many times the height of a man, stood silent in the tiered alcoves that lay around the chamber's circular perimeter. It had been 1,000 years since the last statue was raised, and a millennium more could march by before the honor was again bestowed. There was no furnishing in the cloister of remembrance, no seat upon which the captains could rest, and no council table to pound in support. Each captain took his place at the room's perimeter, while Pugh, as head of the council, stood in the center, pacing to address each of his brothers as he needed. Pugh had ordered Garradon's presence. The sergeant now stood in the space set aside for the 3rd Company's captain. He was soon called upon as the witness to Lysander's part in his company's near demise. Garradon addressed the assembly calmly, for his anger had cooled with the passing of weeks. Captain Hagen, commander of the 5th Company, was another matter. He had dwelt greatly on events and come to realize that his own company, though scared during the Dorne planet strike, could have easily have suffered in the 3rd's stead. Anger bubbled beneath his otherwise clinical account. Hagen gave projections of what would have happened had Lysander not divided the strike force's company, and if he had not begun the planet strike until the Ultramarines and Blood Angels could have provided support. Yet it was Lysander's own testimony that was more damning in Pugh's eyes, albeit unintentionally. The first captain spoke of the Imperial Fist's tradition of sacrifice, of their duty to crush the work of traitors wherever they took root. There could not be, he maintained, too high a price to pay in pursuit of this cause. The Iron Warriors were the Imperial Fist's burden to bear, and their honor to defeat. Without looking at Garradon, Lysander scorned the idea that assistance had ever been acquired, and moreover suggested that the Ultramarines' arrival had in fact created the distraction which allowed Warsmith Shantu to escape. As Lysander spoke, Pugh marked the approving expressions and nods of affirmation given by fully half of the captains present. As a mere acting captain, Garradon had no votes upon the council. Lysander's words and demeanor had spoken to the Imperial Fist's selflessness and self-reliant tradition, and those captains with whom such things resonated strongest were inclined to overlook where the path had led them. Pew had hoped to salvage some of the unity from Dorne by demoting Lysander, making him an example of pride gone awry, the lesson of generations to come. The chapter master was certain that the first captain would have recovered from such a blow and would have even emerged the stronger of it. Such a thing was impossible now. With the chapter council so evenly divided, an obvious disapproval would create division. On the other hand, to not act would drive a wedge between Lysander and those captains who disapproved of his actions at Dorne. As chapter master, Pew did not need the consent of his captains to make a decision, but he had long ago learned that leadership was more effective when widely subtle. Dorne, for all his fortitude, had understood that concept, and now Pew resolved to emulate his forefather. Rather than put the matter to vote, Pew decreed that Lysander would set aside his duties as first captain for a time, and take Vogan's place as commander of the battered Third Company. There was criticism in that course of action, for it was an obvious demotion. However, Pew pointed out that there was honor as well, and reminded that all that were present that he could think of no one better to place to rebuild the shattered company from their current lamented state. Lysander's skill as a drill master had not faded since his days as a sergeant, and there would be much work for him to rebuild the Third. It was one thing to draft replacements from the reserve companies to replenish the Third's losses. It was another thing entirely to accept those warriors to act as a single unit from the very start. Pew furthermore ordered the Sergeant Julin would assume command of the First Company until such time as Lysander's task was completed, though all noted that the chapter master set no timescale under which he expected this to be achieved. Garridon frowned at his chapter master's words, but said nothing. He had hoped that the temporary command of the Third would become permanent, but was enraged that it would pass on to the very man responsible for its near destruction. Even Garridon's status as sergeant was now in doubt, for he recalled that too well that his last conversation with his new captain had ended with a threat of sanction. For this part, Lysander was careful to maintain even tones as he accepted his chapter master's judgment. Moreover, he thanked Pew for the opportunity to forge the Third Company in battle against the Iron Warriors as he himself had been forged. Sean too, Lysander insisted, would at last be brought to account for his crimes. Lysander's expression stiffened noticeably when Pew informed him that the Third would not be assigned to pursue the Iron Warriors. Rather, they would persecute a new campaign, a crusade of thunder against the orcs of Magor Rith, whose threat had been growing for several years. Against these new foes, the Third Company would hone their skills and prove themselves worthy of the tradition they bore. Lysander looked around the cloister for support, but none he found. Without a word, he strode from the room and into his new future as captain of the Third. With Pew's decision, momentum for the Crusade of Thunder began to grow. However, Lysander's command as yet consisted only of some 30 warriors and the battle barge Storm of Wrath. It was the foundation of a mighty force, but little more. The Third's loss would have to be replenished before the campaign could truly start. 7 sergeants had been lost in Dorne, and for the most part, their replacements were chosen from those brothers who had survived the battle. Sergeant Garridon was surprised when Lysander consulted him about which of the Third Company's warriors were most suitable for promotion. As with almost every word that passed between the two at the time, the conversations were stilt and awkward, with both men making a poor show of hiding their mutual dislike. Nevertheless, Garridon experienced the first spark of a grudging respect for his new captain, if only for the professionalism with which he took his new duty. This grew further when Lysander confirmed that he was content for Garridon to remain in position as Squad Primus Sergeant, and even offered a grudging apology for the previously threatened demotion. Garridon took both of these things with much the same ill grace as they were offered. In the end, several of the vacant sergeant positions were filled by survivors of Dorne, 2 by sergeants from the 7th Company, and 1 by the respected Sergeant Odin, a 1st Company veteran. With the appointments determined, the replenishment draft began. Many of the 3rd Company's new warriors, some 60 battle brothers in all, came from the reserve companies. Captain Joan, 7th Company, which had itself recently returned from a campaign amongst the Ghoul Stars, contributed almost 40 tactical marines, which, at Lysander's instruction, were divided amongst the battle-worn squads. No unit would be manned entirely by the less experienced warriors of the reserve companies. The remaining inductees were scouts that Lysander personally selected from the 10th Company. He took only the most promising recruits, those that the Captain Monteith considered ready to make the transition to full battle brother. These, like the inductees from the reserves, were spread throughout the company. All told, the flurry of drafting and reassignment brought the 3rd Company's roster up to its official strength of 105 battle brothers, plus support personnel and transport crew. Chaplain Marvok, preserved from injury on Taladorn by the Emperor's grace, and by the force field within his Rosarius, relished his company's restoration. He prowled the Storm of Wrath's decks in search of infractions performed by battle brothers' use to the lax ways of the chapter's other chaplains, who Marvok mistrusted for the weakness he imagined them to possess. Brother Conrath, preserved from a second death by his armored sarcophagus, had been carefully restored to full function by the chapter's tech marines. He was joined by another dreadnought, Brother McCann, who had been awoken from his slumber specifically to lend his might to the crusade. Upon learning that McCann had once been Lysander's sergeant, Garradon wondered whether Pugh's command stemmed from the desire to allow the captain an old comrade, or because the chapter master believed that McCann's influence would change Lysander's stubbornness. With the ranks of the 3rd Company filled, Lysander requested and received the honor guard of the 1st Company Terminators. He also requisitioned some 30 Centurion warsuits, several Vindicators, a Predator battle tank, and the Land Raider Legend of Roma. Not content with that, he then convinced Captain Monthius to assign 3 of his scout squads to the strike force, the Captain Hagen to part with 3 of the 5th Company's precious Storm Talon gunships. Only when the last of these attack crafts were secured aboard the Storm of Wrath did Lysander at last order the battle barge to break formation with phalanx and lead out into the tides of the warp. The Crusade of Thunder had begun, but none of those who set out upon the voyage knew where it would end. Captain Lysander utilizes the superb protection of the master-crafted Indominus pattern Terminator armor to lead the veterans of the Imperial Fist 1st Company in dealing deadly melee combat and boarding actions. Lysander wields the Fist of Dorne, which is the legendary master-crafted thunderhammer traditionally wielded by the captain of the Imperial Fist's 1st Company. The weapon is shaped to resemble the gauntlet fist that is holding each end of the Warhammer. The arcane technologies built into the Fist of Dorne allow it to strike with far more powerful blows than any other of the normal thunder hammers, and the weapon was designed to be most effective when used to assault heavy armored vehicles and fortifications. Lysander carries a storm shield, which is a large and heavy shield that can house extensive webs of field generation circuitry in their thick plating. The shield's generated energy can fend off bullets and blasts from afar, while the physical shield itself protects against melee attacks. Captain Lysander's mighty storm shield bears the heraldry of his chapter and includes multiple purity seals and a teleporter Homer. And those were 40 facts on Lysander. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, share it with your friends and thank our patrons on Patreon. It's because of them that we can do this. Link in the description if you guys want to support us. It's $1 a month. That dollar goes a long way, so thank you ahead of time. I finally found all of the videos that I created from the past, created this huge compilation video of Lysander. If you guys have suggestions for other characters that we haven't done in the past, please comment down below. We're going to be trying to focus on individual characters in the days to come. And I hope you guys are enjoying the longer videos. It just means more badass videos to come very soon. But with that said, I'll talk to you tomorrow. This is Gershwin with One Mind Syndicate signing out.
to put my freedom first in any